to our lesson for the intermediate level. In this lesson, I'm going to tell you about a couple of things. First of all, I bet you already know the opening principles. While I'll mention it briefly, I'd like to talk about when you would consider or look for making exceptions to it. Another thing I'll be telling you about is basic pawn endgames when there is only one king and pawn versus a king. And finally, I'd like to end every lesson at this level with some amazing, beautiful, miraculous position. So that's our lesson plan. First of all, I would like to just very quickly go over the opening principles, and that is, of course, the importance of the center squares in the beginning of the game, the fact that you'd want to develop your knights and bishops, preferably in a way that they control the 4 center squares we talked about. And then you'd like to put your king into safety, that is, to castle. I bet you know all that already. But now we are going to look at situations when you'd want to make an exception. Not on the first move, of course, yet. The game we are about to examine is played by one of the great heroes of chess, the former world champion Alexander Alekhine, against Rozanov, in a game from 1908. Alekhine started the game by playing e4, which of course follows all the basic opening principles, putting a pawn right in a center square, controlling a second center square, as well as opening up the diagonal of White's bishop as well as White's queen. Black immediately played a little bit of an offbeat move, and I would say probably a second-rate move compared to other moves like playing e7 to e5 or c7 to c5 or some other moves that right away fight for the center squares. Also, the disadvantage of Black's first move is that it allows White comfortably putting a second center pawn right in the middle of the board. Black played a natural move, bishop b7. Of course, every time throughout the game and starting from the very beginning, you need to ask yourself the question, what does my opponent want to do? And in this case, you'll notice what he wants to do, what Black wants to do right now is capturing that pawn on e4. Once you're ready with the answer to that question, namely, what does my opponent want to do? Your next thought should be, how do I defend against it? Or do I need to defend against it? Well, in this case, you certainly would not want to lose a pawn for nothing. Generally, you have one of several things that you can do. You can either protect the piece that has been attacked, you can move it away out of danger's way, or at times you may counterattack. Well, in this case, Alekhine chose a very logical move, that is, continue developing at the same time while defending that pawn on e4. And Black played e6, also opening the diagonal of a second bishop. And Alekhine followed by developing the second knight. So far, White definitely is playing ideally, following the opening principles, while Black is doing okay, but not the most ideal way, because it allowed White to have conveniently 2 center pawns in the middle of the board. And now came an interesting move, but probably not a very good one. Black chose to play d5, trying to instigate a confrontation right away in the middle of the board. Again, the question of course needs to be asked and answered, what does black intend to do? Well, it's not very hard to see that black is trying to capture that pawn on e4, because then if the white knight would capture, the bishop is also from behind attacking that same e4 square. So definitely white needs to react. Of course, white has a number of choices. One is to push the pawn to e5 and close the position. It's certainly not a bad strategical move, because now black's bishop on b7 is kind of a little bit limited at the moment, and also white would have gained space advantage. Another option would be to, let's say, capture our attacker, namely capture on d5, which is okay as well. But Alekhine played an even better move by playing bishop b5. And this is one of those situations when white is ignoring the threat and counterattacks. Now, generally, I would say never give a check in the early stage of the game when this check can be answered by a pawn move, resulting in the bishop needing to retreat. But in this case, actually, by doing that, the black bishop on b7 is getting even more limited in activity. Therefore, it's one of those situations when white purposefully is losing a move by moving the bishop twice, moved it back on the following move to d3. Again, another thing that is part of the basic opening principles, don't move the same piece twice, but in this case, white does it on purpose by provoking black to play c7 to c6. Let's go back though and see what happens if black would have played a different move. For example, let's start with, why not just block the check by developing the knight to d7. As you can notice, now that knight moved into a pin, and moving into pins is usually not an advisable thing. However, if white doesn't try to take advantage of it right away, black may have an opportunity to get out of the pin later. Therefore, whenever a pin is there, always look out for ways trying to take advantage of it. And in this case, that move is, try to figure it out. You may want to pause the lesson for a moment. The answer is knight to e5. Indeed, now white is using the pin, attacking the knight a second time. And for example, if black defends the knight by developing with knight to f6, then white would capture, and play bishop g5, very ambitiously creating a second pin. Now, I think it's pretty clear that black is in quite serious trouble because, for example, after the natural bishop to e7, what would white do? White would remove the defender of the knight on d7. Remember, the knight is pinned, so it's not allowed to move anywhere because the king can never be left in a check. And after the recapture with the bishop, white would simply win the knight for nothing. Let's get back to the game position. After the bishop b5 check. What would happen if black would block the check by moving the knight to c6? Well, black would face similar problems, namely that the knight again is pinned. And learning from the previous variation, I bet you'll find the correct move here, which is knight to e5 again. Using that pin, obviously the knight cannot move, the black knight from c6 cannot move because it's pinned. And now white actually has a very strong initiative. For example, after knight g to e7, that would defend the knight, white would again capture, capture, and start an early attack. And now white brings the queen to h5, all the way to h5, threatening kind of in a primitive way to checkmate by queen captures f7. Again, remember, this is an exception. Normally, we do not get our queen into the game this early. However, when our opponent does not follow correctly the opening principles, gets into pins, therefore gives us opportunities, it's important to take advantage of them before the opportunity goes by. Now after g6, queen f3, again, black's pieces are not well coordinated and black needs to further weaken his position by making another pawn move, by moving the pawn to f5, and now again the second pin, just like in the previous variation, resulting in winning at least a pawn on d5, followed by queen d6, which moves out of the pin on the dark squares, and now white can win a pawn at least by capture, capture, and queen d5, probably even more, because the other knight is also in trouble here in the pin. Again, let's go back to the main game, and after bishop b5 check, the two knight moves blocking the check on c6 or d7 are really not very good. A little bit better would be blocking with the bishop, when white would probably trade pawns and maybe play queen e2 check, or could possibly just castle right away, also with a better, slightly better position, because white is much better developed. As you can see, black's pieces are completely undeveloped. Let's continue with the game. After the check, and black played the most natural and best move, blocking with the pawn. And now white retreated the bishop to d3. Black developed the knight, knight f6. And white played e5, gaining time by attacking black's knight. And the black knight moved away the knight to d7. And this is really the interesting part of the game, because typically one would just castle here. That would certainly be the most natural move based purely on the opening principles. But here, white has actually a very ambitious way to play that gives white more of an advantage than just castling. And Alekhine played knight g5 early on. Usually these type of moves are based on tactics. I always say, jokingly, that chess is 99% tactics, which is a famous saying from about 100 years ago, which may be a slight exaggeration, but indeed tactics are extremely important, because all games at one point or another involve tactics, and the strategical decisions may be based on them. Well, as we can see, the white knight attacks black's pawn on h7 right now. Well, in such situations, the first question should be, what if black simply moves the pawn and attacks the knight? Well, here the answer is another ambitious move, moving the queen out to h5. Note that there is a pin, so if the black pawn would capture the knight on g5, the rook would be hanging on h8. But what happens if black, for example, just defends that pawn on f7? Well, here comes the tactics. Try to pause and figure out what's the correct move here for white. And the correct move is knight captures f7, a beautiful tactical opportunity based on the fact that after queen would capture the knight, bishop g6 pin would come, and winning black's queen. Quite a nice line, isn't it? Black saw this and played bishop to e7, with the idea that now if white captures the pawn, then the knight would be kind of trapped after playing g6. Now the best white can do is move the knight to f6, and then after knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, black won the pawn back with an okay position. So what to do in this position after bishop went to e7? Well, if knight h7 is not the best try, let's look for bringing another piece to the attack. I think queen to h5 is not a bad idea either, but Alekhine chose a different move, queen to g4, creating another interesting tactical possibility. First of all, renewing the threat of capturing on h7, because then, like let's say if black makes kind of a totally ignorant move like knight a6, after knight h7, g6, white would have several options. First of all, the knight would be free to retreat to g5, because now, in addition to white's bishop on c1, also white's queen on g4 would support that square, but also white would have another combination, sacrificing the bishop for a pawn, and then actually quickly checkmating black. Again, let's go back to the actual game. After queen g4, what would happen if black pushes again h6, attacking the knight? Well, white has now another beautiful tactical possibility. You can be proud of yourself if you figured this one out. Here the correct move is knight takes f7, king takes, followed by bishop g6 check, king f8, and queen e6. You can see the beautiful working together of white's queen and bishop, and the threat is queen to f7 checkmate, which black cannot prevent without losing his queen. Again, we're going back to the actual game. Black did not play h6 in this position. Black instead played knight to f8, protecting that pawn on h7. Or at least, so he thought. And now, believe it or not, the sacrifice comes anyway. And white played knight takes h7. If now the black knight captures, then white captures on g7, attacking the rook in the corner, and then after the rook moves, for example rook f8, white can just simply capture the knight and be up 2 pawns. Black tried something different. Rook captures knight, bishop captures, and knight captures. Now black gave up his rook and pawn for a bishop and a knight, but white is getting a second pawn also. And attacking the knight had to move. And now the big problem for black is that white has another very nice tactical opportunity. H4, with the very simple idea of trying to promote that pawn. But what happens if now black captured that pawn? Well, this is another good moment to try to stop for a moment and figure out for yourself, what should white do? And the answer is, white has a nice combination by sacrificing the rook for the bishop, followed by another forceful move, bishop to g5. And even though black can win another rook and then capture on a1, after queen f6, black would be helpless against the checkmate threats both on d8 and e7. Black can protect against one, but not both. In the actual game, black did not capture the rook on a1 in this position, but captured the pawn on g2. It did not change white's answer. White played queen f6 anyway with the same threats. At least black can avoid immediate tragedy, immediately ending the game by sacrificing the queen for the bishop, but in reality it doesn't save the game because white now has a very significant material advantage. I'll just show quickly the rest of the game. Black played knight g6, white played f4, trying to play f5 on the following move. That explains black's next move, knight e7, preventing that. And of course, white brings the rook into the attack, trying to come to h8. Black responded with knight to d7, and white brings the knight to the attack as well. Of course, white could give a check right away, but it's not really checkmate because the black knight would block it. Alekhine played knight d1, when black answered with knight f8, and the knight is aiming to this beautiful outpost on f6. Continued with bishop c8, knight g4. Now we can see that knight arriving there very soon. And now all of the white pieces working together beautifully in harmony. And the final move of the game was a simplification move when white transformed one type of advantage, namely having an extra queen for black's bishop and knight. Now white captured, giving up his queen in order to gain even more material after these moves. And black was not curious to find out how former world champion Alekhine would checkmate him later from this position, being an extra rook up. Well, I hope you enjoyed this very instructive game by a very famous world champion. Now we move on to a totally different subject, and that is some basic pawn endgames. Well, this is kind of the mother of all pawn endgames, so to say. And it's very important to know that if it's black to move, which is the correct move? There is only one correct move in such situations. There are a number of things that you need to remember about the patterns of such endgames, because the same would work if we would push, let's say, the three pieces on the board to the E file or the F file or to the G file in this same sequence as they are positioned right now. Well, what is the story about? White has a dangerous pass pawn that already reached the 6th rank, only 2 ranks away from promotion. However, as long as the black king is in front of it, the pawn is not going anywhere. The challenge is that the black king needs to move. Black has no choice. In chess, nobody is allowed to say, I pass, I don't want to move now, your turn again. You cannot do that. So the king needs to move, but the big question is, which of these 3 squares is the correct one? For example, moving the king to e8 would lose right away because after king e6, king d8, and the pawn advancing to d7, the king can and has to move to c7, allowing the white king to support the white pawn on d7 in its promotion on the following move to d8. It would be wrong for the same reason moving to c8 as well, because after king c6, king d8, d7, again black would have no choice but move to e7, when the white king would come to c7, and again the white pawn is unstoppable from promoting. Therefore, the only correct move is to move to the middle. So when the king goes to one side, the black king can answer going to the same side. What you need to remember about these type of endgames is that it's only important to move to the same side when the king is right next to the pawn. So here, black would answer by playing king e8, opposite white's king. And when the pawn advances and the king goes to d8, very importantly, now it's white's turn and not black's, and white has a choice between playing king to d6 and creating a stalemate, which ends the game in a draw, or move somewhere else and leave the pawn unprotected when black would obviously capture it, and the game again would end in a draw. So, the correct move is king d8. If the king goes to this side, king c8, d7, king d8, king d6, ending the game in stalemate. In this next example, the story is very similar with reversed colors. As you can see, now black has the extra pawn, and white should try to do the same, not allowing the pawn to get promoted unless white is ready to capture the pawn or the new queen as soon as it promotes. Well, the first rule of thumb is you'd want to keep the king right in front of the pawn if you can. In this case, it's black's turn. So let's suppose black just moves to d5, the king. Then we would want to keep our king right in front of the pawn on d3 as long as we can. Let's say black plays king e5. Now, again, we want to be kind of right in front of the pawn as much as we can. Moving to c4 would lose right away because the king e4 and then the pawn would get promoted with the help of the king. So the correct move is moving to d2, although now that the black pawn is not yet on the 3rd rank, that is 2 ranks away from the promotion square, but it's still 3 squares. In fact, it's not that crucial, and even king e2 would not lose the game. Although I just prefer to keep the right method staying under the pawn as much as you can. After king e4, now of course already it's very important that the king goes on the same side to e2. After d3 check, stay right under the pawn as much as you can. And here we actually have the very similar position as we had in the previous example. Very important which way the king goes. The only correct square is That's right in the middle, to be flexible, to respond going on the same side as black's king goes. So if king c3, the answer is king c1, or if the black king goes to e3, then king e1. Remember, if the black king goes to c4, then again you have to move back right under the pawn and not to the sides. And finally, something very cute, the beauty of chess. I'm absolutely a big fan of all the incredible things that can happen on the chessboard. It's just really fascinating. So this is one of those brilliances why I love chess so much. Look at this position. White is a rook ahead, but black is about to promote the pawn to a queen. For example, if white would play king d3, black would promote the pawn to a queen. White captures, king captures, and if white is trying to go after black's pawn on e6, black arrives just on time in counterattacking white's pawn on d4, and after king captures pawn, king captures, and the game is a draw. So let's go back all the way to the beginning. And here comes the brilliancy. The only move to win the game is to play a totally unexpected move. And that is rook to a1. What? That's hanging the rook. That's right. Absolutely true. King captures, and then the king locks in, so to say, in a prison, the black king, forcing black to move his other pawn to e5. Now, of course, the game would end in a draw immediately by stalemate after pawn takes pawn. But white can do better. Instead of greedy pawn takes pawn, just push through. Push, 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 and now white promotes first, and after black promotes the queen, white checkmates after a check on d4. Beautiful, isn't it? Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, learned from former world champion Alekhine, learned basic pawn endgames, and saw a brilliant example of beauty in chess. Well, hope to have you back next week. So long until then.